I felt that I recognized an, something essential in the Bible, which corresponded to my intuitions of God. That the person, the character of God, as revealed through both the Old and New Testaments, rhymed with, answered to whatever it was I thought I was talking to when I thanked the sun for shining on me.
Hello again, culminators. Today I've got a new friend. When I say a new friend, I mean I just followed him today. And that's on me. And when I say followed him, I mean I am sitting in actually in a van outside his house. Spencer
I was
Klavan.
wondering who that was. Yeah, it's a relief to know it's you. I thought it might be
Well, you
someone more
think that
dastardly.
now.
Yeah.
So Spencer Klavan is a thinking man. And that's what we go for around here. He previously wrote a book last year, and he seems to me not only be a thinking man, but a writing man. He does a lot of writing. He is an associate editor, an associate editor. You are some kind of editor for the Claremont Institute.
That's right. Associate editor.
Oh,
Yes.
I got that right. Wow, that's pretty
Oh
something.
yeah.
That's pretty amazing thing to memorize. I never really understood what the nomenclature, the hierarchy of editorships are. But today we're going to talk about ideas. But the interesting thing about Spencer is last year's book. Okay, I'm going to throw this up because I got excited. I forgot which book we were going to talk about, and I said, "Oh, I really like this because look, he wrote a. I mean, I think about 30% of my guests are guests who are going to tell us how to save the West, and and look there, yep, there it is. The return with a V type U cover. And that's fine, because I'm an ancient guy. But I love the idea that he has these 5 bullet points. The crisis of, and because they just sound like things that your friend Ron Coleman says very frequently. Crisis of reality. Is there such a thing as an objective truth? One of my famous pinned tweets over the years has been, we don't just disagree on ideology anymore. We disagree on the very empirical reality in which we're living.
That's right.
Crisis of the body, not one of my topics. I mean, I have my own crisis of the body, but nothing that anyone wants to hear about.
Don't we all? No, don't worry. It's turns out you're not alone.
The crisis of meaning, absolutely. I mean, I don't understand, frankly, if you don't believe in God the Creator and revealed truth, I don't frankly understand what gets you out of bed in the morning. And I think we'll have the opportunity to talk about that more in this discussion. Crisis of religion. Well, I suppose that is the flip side of the previous bullet point. Crisis of the regime. Forget it. I mean, that's all we talk about, right? But
Mm.
there's another book, and it's the new book because this is Spencer Klavan, and like I said, he's got a lot to say. And this one is all. This is a little bit more focused, I suppose. Light of the mind, light of the world, illuminating science through faith. I've got numerous titles behind me here on
Hmm.
the interaction, the encounter between science and faith, the false dichotomy that one. I mean, there's a dichotomy, but the extent of it is limited, I believe.
Right.
And I'm gonna see. He says I'm right, and he wrote a whole book on it.
There you go. That's why I wrote the book, actually. You didn't
So
know
enough.
this, but I've
That's
been
right.
just planning to prove you right my whole
Eliminating
career.
science through faith, and this is a great topic, and it's also a book that I would always get books like this to have around in the house when my kids were growing up because I wanted them to understand that even though they're growing up in a strictly Jewish Orthodox uh, educational system, they should not in any way think that we're encouraging a blind sort of faith or a know nothingism. On the contrary, Spencer, after that preposterously unstructured introduction, welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you for
And I'm
having me.
very eager to talk
It's great
about.
to be here.
So, does the first book lead to the second book?
Absolutely. Yes. And you're one of the first people to notice that, actually. It's quite apparent to me, but as you were walking through it, I was remembering exactly the process that led to this latest book. And it was How to Save the West also has a progression. It presents as kind of five bullet points, but when you get into the book, you realize that each one is sort of depends on the last. So I think the crisis of reality is maybe the one that we see most in evidence most regularly in our daily life. You log onto social media, and as Scott Adams says, we're watching two movies, or at least two movies. You know, throughout the country, people are in dispute over these basic facts about definitions of words, first principles, these sorts of things. But the point of the book was to lead people step by step, sort of on from that evident crisis into some of the underlying philosophical issues that have been plaguing us for longer than just the most recent news cycle, for 500 years, in some cases 2000 years and more. And as you walk through that book, and as I walk through the process of writing it, you do, I think, ultimately arrive at the inescapable question of God. And that's why the crisis of religion is sort of the climax of the book, and it moves. The last section on the regime, which is about politics, is sort of saying you can't talk about our politics until you've understood that what we're really grappling with is this 500-year long, if not more, 500-year long trajectory away from God that the West has been on, and this sort of forgetfulness that we've fallen into, the dream of a godless world that we can describe everything without reference to supernatural truth or transcend. And so the reason then that in this new book I've turned to the relationship between science and faith is because I think, and you can tell me whether this resonates with your experience raising your kids, growing up, the major obstacle to addressing faith sensibly, thinking clearly about first principles, absolute truth, the ultimate questions, was the ambient suspicion among my peers, and in my own heart, I should say, since I was not raised religious, that in order to bite the bullet and really believe, you had to abandon your reason, and you especially had to abandon your reason when it came to material fact, that is science, which was kind of the gold standard for epistemology, I think, among my peers. And it's based on this story we got, which is really very simplified, about how reason had to break free of the church. In the Enlightenment, we had the glorious, pure rays of understanding that finally, beginning with Galileo and perhaps ending with the French Revolution, at last destroyed the superstitious strictures of the church. Um, and this is obviously a historical nonsense. And so the first half of the book is a history of science that stretches back into antiquity and begins with the Greeks and the Babylonians, and also with the people, the ancient Jews and the people of the Torah, and then moves up through to the point at which the crisis actually emerges, which is somewhat later than we typically think. It's really in the 1700s and the 1800s that people start to think there is this dispute between science and religion, and that religion's hogwash and science is reality. But the second part of the book is somewhat more novel, I think, perhaps, in that not only does it argue science emerges out of religion, but that this narrative we have that science is antithetical to religion is scientifically out of date. So that actually our governing assumptions, our cultural narrative, hasn't yet caught up to what is actually going on in quantum physics, cosmology, and a few other areas of modern science, which is again pointing back toward the necessity of taking stock of things that are more than matter, principles like mind, perhaps even a governing mind or a primary mind that brings the universe into being. And that's why it's called light of the mind, light of the world, is because ultimately these two things diverge in the middle, the world and the mind, or science and religion, and then they eventually kind of come back together at the end. So the book is kind of a hard reset, I guess, on the war of science and religion.
Light reading.
Yeah, shouldn't take you too long.
First of all, I'm intrigued by the idea that you were like me, were not raised religious,
Mm-hmm.
but by virtue of intellectual investigation, came to conclude that you can't answer the important questions that interest you, which happen to be, like me, political questions, perhaps to a lesser extent, in my case, philosophical questions, without reference to the great chain of being, without understanding that this is God's world. We're not merely. I mean, why would you even ask the question?
Mm-hmm.
Why does it even matter? And I don't want to
Yeah.
reduce this to the level of a Twitter exchange with an atheist. I mean, these are some of the dumbest things you see, on X.
Uh-huh.
The Odyssey is considered to be like a major insight,
Yeah.
from people. But what was it in your answer or description of the book that you wanted me to tell you whether it comported with my experience with raising my now adult children?
That I was curious whether you said that you wanted your kids to have to be surrounded by books that made them aware both of science and of theology, which was also my experience, although we didn't have a sort of official family religion. But I was saying that the atmosphere I grew up in, which was sort of a California, vaguely liberal atmosphere, was one in which, although we might have had varying opinions about the usefulness or not of faith, it was taken for granted that there was this conflict. We were told the Galileo story in school, and there was an ambient kind of
And let me
anti-faith.
stop you. So that when we say the Galileo story, what we mean is this this parody or fairy
Yeah,
tale that Galileo. It's very simple. Galileo wanted to tell the truth, and
right,
the church wanted everyone to believe something that was false
right.
because somehow, and this I never understood, somehow if Galileo was right, there was no God.
Right. And that's not at all, by the way, what the church argued. And this is, of course, I retell this story in the book in, I think, a more truthful way. But Galileo and the church were both well aware of ways to square what's called heliocentrism, the idea that the earth revolves around the sun, with the Bible. That was not an issue at all. Sometimes I think in school you're taught it's because the Bible says that the sun revolves around the earth, and they couldn't figure out a way that that could be true while Galileo could be right. And the clerics of Galileo's day had very sophisticated arguments, as did Galileo, to the effect that, okay, so in some of the Psalms it says that the sun runs its course from east to west, but Virgil also says, this is what Copernicus argues, Virgil also says that the harbor backs away from the ship as you leave the port. And everybody knows the harbor's not moving, the ship is, but we talk in terms of human experience. We tell
And human
these
perception.
stories. Yes, that's right, from our point of view. And scripture too condescends to speak and describe things in human terms. So that was not the problem at all. The problem was about how best to honor God's gift of reason to mankind. And that's a religious, interreligious dispute. That's about what is our responsibility given that the world, which everybody involved agreed, the world is invested with a rational order. And man's mind is invested almost more miraculously with the blueprint of that rational order in his reasoning faculties. Is it right then that we should expect to understand the whole universe, and how should we understand it in terms of numbers and figures, or is there some other more mysterious way in which we're called to understand the world? And that was their fight. Um, but I was just curious whether your kids grew up with the same kind of cartoon version of that story that I did.
It's not. It's simply not a thing.
Hmm.
We our kids, Orthodox Jewish children, grow up, especially in the more traditional Orthodox world, um, with a very clear understanding that there are all kinds of things about the universe and about creation that do not comport with normal human perception and experience.
Hmm.
And that's not only is it fine, but it's part of God's plan that it should be that way.
Hmm.
And sort of there's a code word that is used to describe that um, paradox, which is dinosaurs.
Uh-huh.
We know, right? We know there are dinosaur bones.
Uh-huh.
There's excellent empirical and inductive and deductive proof that these were animals that we don't have in the world anymore,
Hmm.
without even necessarily coming onto the question of carbon dating, of how old the universe is.
Hmm.
Just merely the fact that I often describe things as billions of years ago in geological time. Whatever the heck that
Right.
means, I don't know what
Right.
that means. Of course we know. I mean, even William, even in the Scopes monkey trial, right? This was fundamental thing. Obviously Adam and Eve were not created as infants; they were created as adults.
Hmm.
The world, they ate from a tree, not from a seed that had just been planted. I mean,
Hmm.
all kinds of God can do it any way he wants to. That's in and
Hmm.
of itself not a really hard question. But we do try to resist. There is a little bit of a theological or a philosophical debate within the Jewish world of, do we say that science doesn't matter at all and
Right.
it's just simply two tracks, or do we say, and this is sort of the approach of the German school and later the sort of the what we might call its offspring. Do we integrate it?
Hmm.
It's I don't want to step on your book here, but one thing we do know, and you allude to, and I see this alluded to in the description of the book, the more science learns, the less the claims of the Torah and also the mystical aspects of the Torah. And looking at the cover of your book,
Hmm.
I see a, a you know a there's a this is there's something mystical,
Hmm.
which is kind of a could be a loaded phrase. There's something mystical that you are alluding to.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
one of the things that is taught in classic Jewish sources, including the Kabbalah, Zohar, is that the universe is constantly being recreated by God. That there is no
Hmm.
such thing as stasis, and the only one of the reasons that we express our gratitude to God as often as we do. And by the way, I don't think I answered your question adequately. I don't think and I don't think I can on one foot, but I'm just going to go where the conversation's taking me. Um,
Sure.
but when they go through this, and the Smithsonian, and in 30 or 40 years, I don't want them to say Coleman didn't even bother answering the question.
Huh.
One of the reasons that we express gratitude to God so often and so fulsomely is he could at any time decide not to bother, so to speak. No, nothing's a bother for God, but not to continue recreating the world at every infinitely small unit of time. And that was,
Hmm.
I think, until maybe about 100 years ago, considered to be a very cute concept. Well, guess what?
Hmm.
Along comes, physics, modern, physics and the theory of relativity. And turns out everything's energy. Every,
Hmm.
everything's energy. Basically, everything is being recreated at every single infinitely small quantum of time. And the more science we learn, And the more we learn about the way the universe works, the what we're asked to consider to be coincidences and happenstance, and the more we understand about the phenomenal nature of humanity,
Hmm.
the harder it gets to. I mean, it seems to me that if there's any, when I first encountered traditional religious thinking in the Jewish world,
Hmm.
it was through a program at the Aish Torah Yeshiva in Jerusalem, which specializes in reacquainting people from uneducated Jewish backgrounds with traditional Jewish thinking. And one of the things I learned was about cognitive dissonance.
Hmm.
And I came to understand why it is so hard for people to change their minds about this. How did you overcome your cognitive dissonance, or was it just that I mean, it doesn't sound like you're describing a particularly um, doctrinaire system that you were starting off with.
No, not at all. And in fact, I think my particular household was probably more open to changes of religion than most because both of my parents also were, as they say now, on a journey. My mother came from a vaguely Catholic, but functionally atheist background, and my father was a lapsed Jew who had ended up in a sort of Zen Buddhist um, way station, I think you could call it. And so I think, family, if we had a family
He didn't,
sigil,
but that was a
and
way station for him, right? He ended up
yes, he's
was it
Christian now.
becoming
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
Catholicism.
No, no. It's high church Anglicanism, I guess is how I would
Got it.
describe it.
Mm-hmm.
It's close to Catholicism. Um, but if we had a family crest or a motto, I think it would have reflected our pride in genuine intellectual openness. I think that was our creed. Our creed was, this open-ended searching that we were all encouraged to do, and that both of us kids, myself and my sister, were at the time quite pleased that we didn't go to Sunday school or any other related institution because we were actively working on this all the time ourselves. Um, and what happened to me was simultaneously intellectual and emotional or personal, in that I had always had a very palpable sense of personality to the universe. I'm told, I don't remember this, but I'm told that I used to walk outside and thank the sun for shining on me. I was basically born a pagan. And it was, and that certainly I recognize myself in that story. That sounds like me. And I think that when I started to become the person who, as you observed, can't shut up and can't stop reading or writing or talking, I ended up going on a literary quest. I just read every piece of scripture I could get my hands on from every tradition I could find. So I read the ages of 14 to 16. I read the Quran. I read the Bhagavad Gita. I read the Tao Te Ching. I read the Bible for the first time in my life from cover to cover, Old and New Testaments. And there
And
were
was
some.
that exercise of reading all these sacred scriptures, was that in any way useful? I mean, because it
Yeah,
strikes me as a little dilettantish,
yeah,
and certainly Catholics and Orthodox Jews take the position that you can't just crack open a Bible
right.
and say I'm now going to understand it. Now I know Protestants take a very different position,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't see how anyone could be inspired by any holy book without a knowledgeable person about that tradition mentoring him as to how to understand it. But what was
No,
your experience?
that's quite astute. I mean, I would say it was certainly useful. it was not conclusive, is how you
Fair
would
enough.
put it. Yeah. um, it was conclusive in one way only, which was that I felt that I recognized at something essential in the Bible, which corresponded to my intuitions of God. That the person, the character of God, as revealed through both the Old and New Testaments, rhymed with, answered to whatever it was I thought I was talking to when I thanked the sun for shining on me. And so there was that element of it that was this is why I say it was both personal and intellectual, and that I was certainly thinking about, and I should say that I was at the same time, going through your usual kind of high school, or perhaps not usual anymore, but what in my you know family was a usual thing of like reading Aquinas, reading Dante, reading this sort of tradition, getting a grounding in the tradition after the scriptures. But that this was really a process of seeking a person. I was looking for somebody that I felt I knew, and this is why I think the Bible ended up becoming not simply a notch in my reading belt, but rather a book with which I had one of those books with which I had a relationship, that I was turning to the Bible in moments of crisis and angst. And it was through that process that I did end up kind of actually hanging out with a lot of Catholics in high school, and or rather in college, and didn't become a Catholic, but sort of learned, I guess, the cultural and traditional elements of Christianity from the Catholics. They were the ones who probably schooled me in some of the stuff you're talking about. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. It does.
Okay.
And I mean, we are talking about stuff here that any one of these things can could really splinter off into a very extensive conversation. Um, I want to switch it over a little bit
Yeah.
to something that I frequently discuss with my culture critic guests, people like Sora Amari, and again, all of us who are ruining the destruction of traditional society and mores, the previous book. Um,
Right.
what do we do about? I think every one of us agrees on the general proposition that there's no fixing this without finding some healthy and maybe even pluralistic, I think it has to be, way to
Mm-hmm.
reintegrate shared traditional values
Mm-hmm.
into our reference. But what do we do if so many people simply can't find it within them to believe in the source? In other words, there was a generation. I always like to think of Winston Churchill as the epitome of a highly sophisticated, highly intellectual person who was not particularly spiritual, but who understood that he
Mm.
was a Christian, that there was something called Christendom, that its values were worth upholding. He would go to church, he would behave in a more or less moral way. And of course, he was a statesman, so that meant there were also things he did that were maybe not so moral. But that, I think, lasted for maybe 100 years.
Right.
And then when society, especially up the influencers, let's call them, of society, started realizing, I'm not really believing this.
Yeah. Yes.
They just stopped going to church, and and then you end up with sort of amorphous with the nothingness that we have now. How can you turn back the clock on that? And I guess to some extent, since you're wrestling with this period around, the 18th century, maybe the answer lies there.
So this brings me back to what you were saying earlier about your conversation with Randy Barnett and the highest good of man. Because you mentioned Barnett's a Thomist Aristotelian, and this prompted me to recall a letter that my friend Richard Samuelson showed me from John Adams. Adams, I think, here kind of engaging with his erstwhile frenemy Thomas Jefferson, who proclaimed himself an Epicurean. And Adams says, in the ancient world, there were all these various philosophies to choose from, and at least most of them had a lot of dignity and nobility to them. You could be a Stoic, you could be a Peripatetic, you could follow a number of wise teachers among the Greeks and Romans. But our philosophers are all the low, groveling disciples of Epicurus. In other words, all modernity is effectively Epicurean. And it is Epicureanism that describes the world as atoms shooting through a void, creating a multiverse in which the highest good of man is pleasure, or at least the absence of pain, ataraxia, kind of serenity. I always think when I think of Epicurus of wellness culture, I think of like if what we're really trying to be is like safe and well and at peace, then we're basically Epicureans. And Adams has, I think, gotten this really right.
And that's why so many
And
people, like your father during his journey, love that way station
totally. Yes,
because
exactly.
it feels right. It feels
Yes.
right. But
Serenity. Yeah. And the absence, I mean, the Buddhism for my dad, at least, and I think for a lot of Western practitioners, is exactly the release from consequence, or the release from, the terrible existential weight of being accountable to absolutes. Instead, better to treat the whole self as an illusion and make your life about eliminating that anxiety, that fear. Um, this is not the Western way. The Western way, if you think of Aristotle and Thomas, I think you can kind of really picture this as Aristotle tells you a lot about the good of natural man. We're gonna love what's good. We're gonna hate what's evil. We're gonna cultivate the virtues in that, and those habits will eventually build up and build up to the iceberg tip of being a rational animal. That is, we'll have this connection to sort of infinite principles in our reasoning mind. And then Thomas says, yes, and that will then lead you up what you call the chain of being to thinking of the highest cause. And in fact, it turns out you have a destiny there too, beyond the death of your natural body. And this is an incredibly beautiful and ennobling way to live. It's also an extraordinarily high stakes way to live, because if we are in fact accountable to moral absolutes and not simply um, emanations of a universe that is whose reality is independent of us, and in which we, or the idea of the self, is kind of an illusion. But no, actually, you are like, you are Ron and I am Spencer, and that's on purpose. And we, each of us, kind of have responsibility to this higher power. Um, all sorts of things might happen. You might have to change the way you personally live. You might have to go to war with other people who feel differently. You might have trouble living together with the others around you who might dispute or disagree. And this is why I sort of am working this way up to answering your question about pluralism, right? Is that at a certain point, I think, after the Protestant Revolution, after the wars of religion, and after the bloodletting, the internal bloodletting that had let loose, there kind of emerged a quiet agreement that we were going to shelve a lot of these questions, and we were at least just going to leave them outside the public sphere so that we could have basically Voltaire's vision of the London Stock Exchange, where he says the Mohammedan and the Jew and the Christian, they go to the stocks, and only a bankrupt is an infidel. Everybody else gets to hang out together. Um, as an American, I find this very appealing, actually. Like, this is a picture of the world as a big clubbable cocktail party that I really want to join. And
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 this will
I
also
Yeah,
this will end strife.
exactly. Yes, we'll
There
stop
won't be
having
any
wars.
because we know all the wars
Right.
are really religious, religious disputes,
Yes.
and it's all going to be fine unless we have World War One.
Yeah. I'm like, what? Row. Exactly. Yeah. Whoops.
Which,
We,
ironically, though,
yeah.
is despite manifestly not being a religious dispute, was the last nail in the coffin of
Mm.
traditional, that sort of Churchillian. We're going to all go along with it without necessarily being evangelicals because we know it's good and we know it's right. And because there was this idea that, well, God, country, crown, those things just have led us astray. So now let's all become everyone's just going to, I don't know what the thinking was, but it was that we're not going to do that anymore.
Well, we're going to be Epicureans. I mean, this is, I think the answer, the thinking was we're going to pursue serenity, pleasure, well-being, and on our off hours in our private time, we're going to have a sort of hermetically sealed religion of our choosing. Or none. Um, and yeah, that's so interesting about World War One. I mean, this is where I think the guy, for all his many, many other, I think, flaws, the guy who gets this right is Friedrich Nietzsche and Dostoevsky to sort of in a different way. But Friedrich Nietzsche is like, you guys are going to spend this cultural capital down, and then it's not going to be the bright dawn of orderly serenity and virtue that you'd think. Because if the religions caused you to fight over the virtues or the highest questions, they also caused you to believe in them. And if you stop believing in them, you're gonna have to reinvent an entirely new way of living that actually will be much more based on the will and the assertion of the will. Um, and as you indicated, that is kind of what happened. For one thing, the world did not become more peaceful, and for another thing, the world did not become more enjoyable. Like the pleasure that we were promised to get out of this also sort of has started to fade.
And the reduction of
Um,
anxiety,
right. Yeah. Yeah. Like
how'd that go?
doesn't it does exactly. It was not as advertised. We took it home, we got it out of the box, and looked very different than it looked in the pictures and the infomercials. And so I think that now we are faced with a lot of people are faced with this problem that has been brewing in intellectual culture for a long time, which is we we want all the good things that Christendom gave us, as you suggested, um, but many of us feel extremely hesitant to get all of the high stakes questions that Christendom posed to us or to
And
fight for.
pluralism is part of we want pluralism. We
Yes,
like the idea of a tolerant society, and we should,
yes.
I think. But just to give you by way of counterexample, in Israel, when terrible things happen, there's a certain sector of the population that says, people who are not religious, who say, I'm going to return to the religion of our fathers
Hmm.
because I see here, I've looked into the abyss, and I'm going to go back to and in it for a Jew, this is the difference of a Jew in Israel and a Jew
Hmm.
in your father's situation. Or the framework is, this is my tradition, this is my parents or my grandparents in the case of Israelis, because the secular Israelis tend to be already a couple generations removed, and they know where to go. They're even
Mm.
this. They even say among, especially the Sephardic Jews in Israel, who many of whom are not observant, that the synagogue that I don't go to is Orthodox.
Mm.
In other words, I recognize what religion looks like. Well, here in
Yes,
America, we don't have that anymore.
right.
And when we had a Christian nation, we did have it, even if it was only nominally Christian. And this is something that I came to appreciate reading my friend Yoram Hazony's book about
Hmm.
nationalism, which is that it is healthy and normal and good for a nation to have a share, not to say, I'm going to read every single culture's holy book.
Right.
And then I'm going to, wise man that I am, choose the best and the most
Yeah.
convincing no. Start with who you are and where you are, and the tradition that you were born into, with the presumption that maybe God put you in that place, into that tradition for a good reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a really hard thing for Americans to do. But especially
Well,
now that we've lost that moral consensus that existed 2 generations ago, by and Jewish activists who are not so Jewish bear a great deal of blame, in my opinion.
hmm,
Not that they necessarily foresaw that this would happen,
right.
um, for this development, but now we now lack the tools to even address what the challenge of Islam
Right.
to what
Right.
was I know that some people bristle at Judeo-Christian, the concept of Judeo-Christian, but I think it's a legitimate paradigm.
I don't bristle at that at all. I mean, I think it's kind of hyper academic, the objections that get raised to this idea of the Judeo-Christian society. I mean, yes, we all know that these are two different faiths with major theological differences, different premises behind them in some cases, but they also manifestly share a, a scripture, a whole history of tradition, and the points on which they overlap are some of the most important points civilizationally for the West. I mean, the one I always return to is the image of God. You know, the idea of man is in the image of God, which is, I think it's Rabbi Sachs who says it's the most revolutionary idea in the history of human thought or something like that. Um, you know, Christians are also very much about this. It's central for Christians too. And you can trace from that idea any number of uniquely Western political principles which don't make sense without that idea. The notions of individualism, notions of liberty and tolerance, and all sorts of things that we're talking about now. Um, so here's what I'm thinking as you're talking. You know, we're currently in a position where both America's enemies from the right and America's enemies from the left accuse it of being basically founded on this Enlightenment era nothingness. On the right, you have this idea that because America was born in and in some sense out of that moment when we all sort of shelved our big questions and didn't fight over them. Um, America is therefore a godless, like inherently sort of liberal and liberalizing and godless. Um, on the left, I think this is sometimes put forward as the true reality of America, from which America is always falling short, right? That we're not godless enough, actually,
Right.
because we're supposed to be. You know, the promise of the country
Novus
was that we
Ordo
would be.
Secularum is meant to be
Yeah,
a complete break with the old world, which is a really weird thing to say when you're looking at all those
yeah.
references on a dollar bill, where you
Ex-
see Novus Ordo to ancient traditions.
okay, so I suspect that both sides of this, or both versions of this story about America, are deeply flawed, and that the the answer kind of lies in there is an openness inherent in the American attitude toward religion, but it's not, as Buckley might have said, an open-mindedness so great that ideas fall out of its head. In fact, the founders, sort of universally in their writings, and also the founding documents, if you read them carefully enough, are take for granted certain, I would say, Judeo-Christian ideas about God and his relationship to his people. In fact, I would suggest that America maybe represents the best argument for the notion that there are kind of almost like Noahide uh, principles that you can draw out of the religious traditions that gave birth to the West. So not in fact the Noahide laws that are for the Gentiles, but rather the kind of least common denominator of all of these faith traditions that is nevertheless unique and distinctive from, say, Babylonian religion or Islam or whatever. Um, and I don't actually think we're so far we're as far as we might think from being able to run a country on those baseline premises, like that there is a God and that he has certain attributes such as justice, that man is made in his image and should honor that. Um, I think you can run a country on those principles. I don't think that most Americans would hate that country, and I don't think that that country has to conduct religious tests of its citizens or anything like that. In other words, you can belong to any faith you want in that country, but you also can't. There are certain consequences of what you can do at a state level. Like you can't tear down the Ten Commandments uh, out of your courthouse. In fact, you might do the opposite. You might want to put them up, and you might want to make like base religious or base legal arguments on them. This is obviously a much larger sketch that we would have to draw of what this country would look like. But I think that is less of a stretch for us than what some people seem to be imagining, which is like we're going to put on a pope hat and impose
A
the
miter,
magisterium.
a miter.
Yeah.
You know, I we hardly talked about the science part of your book today, but I do think that this is the intellectual preparation that you have to have in order to understand the crisis of science as an alternative worldview.
Yes.
I don't want to say scientism is that's laden, but clearly the idea that science is going to answer questions that spirituality, which is also a terrible word, but that religion has not adequately answered.
Mm-hmm.
If again, the atomic age showed us that that was not the case because
Mm-hmm.
science isn't only a source of good, and also what we've learned in the last 5 years is science science
Yeah.
is as corruptible and untrustworthy as your worst imaginings of any corrupt church.
Right. Absolutely.
Spencer, we hardly got started here today, but that's what happens when you make friends too late.
Yes.
Too late.
Yes.
Everybody buy the book. Follow Spencer. Learn. He's all over the place. He's a true public intellectual, a new generation of which is badly needed in this country. And I hope that you and I can continue this conversation again soon.
Absolutely. I would love that. It's been a delight. And as you say, much more to discuss.
Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.